Oh, Nanabojo, Nin Saojik, Wedem Chigging Donjaba, Benen Dodem. For myself, I'm from the reserve, we call them Chigging, and my clan is Rough Grouse, what we call in our language Bine. So in Chinandam Dashingi, we could you and go yan, we the Bajamagwa gon duck west, Weda sek, meanwhile, Minisino, meanwhile, Gemak. So I'm happy and pleased to be invited to come here and speak about who we call in our language the Weda sek, the braves. Meanwhile, what we say, Minisino and then the warriors, and Ogimak, that means the chiefs who fought during the War of 1812. So what you see here on the first slide is actually taken from a sketchbook that was apparently sketched at Larber Cross, which is in upper state Michigan, now called Harbor Springs. But it was in Larber Cross dated around late 1820s, early 1830s. And when you look at this, you see that the top row is actually called, there's dance, it says. And you see each of the warriors dancing up, and they're coming up with all of their weapons. And they're all approaching this one man who is holding what we call Medewayan, or if it's an otter, it's Nagikawayan, or if it's a fisher, it's Ojikawayan. It's an actual medicine bag. And so they're shooting that up full of power. That's what the first thing they're doing. So now to make some kind of an analogy, we're charging up everything before we go. So that's some of the preparations that go into the war before we go on to the warpath. So now we hear people say that all the braves are heading off to war and going on the warpath. In our language, that word is ndobane. Ndobane, and that actually when you break the word down, it actually means going to seek slaves. So it isn't necessarily that we're out to kill people, but a lot of times what we call these, sometimes they're called mourning, as in somebody's passed away or somebody's missing. In your family, they call it a mourning war, and not necessarily War of 1812, but when they lost somebody, the women particularly would tell their men or their uncles that their son is missing, that they want their son back. So they would go out on the warpath, Ndobane, looking for a slave, and then that's when they would adopt somebody to take the place of that son who was either killed in action or however else they had died. So a lot of non-native people actually got adopted into our nations. And I've been fortunate enough to go to a lot of different museums all over the world, and I went to a museum, National Museum of Scotland, National Museum of Ireland, the British Museum. And at these institutions, there's a lot of times they'll have the whole outfit that one of these people, particularly soldiers, when they get adopted, they'll get a whole outfit and they get an Anishinaabe name. So when you're actually living on the front as either Irish or Scottish or British soldier, sometimes you actually ended up siding more with native people, and you ended up taking a lot of different items as well as customs and practices in order to fight war the way we fight war here. So that's the first part, is all these weapons, we call them in our language, bagamagan, that means a war club. Kwakato bagamagan, that's the one with the round-headed one. Wagagitchagan, that's what they call a gun stock. And of course we have our pipes in that. So people used to actually have a war bundle as well, the actual bag with medicines in it, and there was different types of medicines that they would have that they would keep. So that's what they're doing there on that top row, is they're actually charging that up, and these are Odawa people. And this sketchbook is actually in Berlin, at a museum in Berlin. I can't say the German name, museum, der Volkerkunde, something to that effect. So excuse my German. The next part, of course, is you see the middle row, the Anishinaabe. This is the other thing that I use this sketchbook for, is you see how they wore their feathers at the front. And now, of course, you see a lot of people, in these pan-Indian moments, they're wearing all these long, elaborate headdresses, but here we used to just wear them straight up. And you see this fellow at the bottom. There's a number of different sketches in this book, and this guy is the only one that always faces the viewer. And so what the idea is that this is the actual author / artist, and this is a biography of his life. so that he was involved in this war party, and all of them went on the war path, and then they chased away the Americans. And in what we used to call them, the Americans, we call them chumokman, I mean the big knives, but we also call them the men who wear hats to distinguish them from the French or the British. And then here, so it says combat, dance, combat, and then here they're going over the hill and coming back, and they captured the colors of the British, I mean the Americans. So that's a biographical tale, a pictographic representation of one battle, but we don't know actually the name of the author of that book or the artist, but we know that it's from L'Arbre Croche. A lot of times people misunderstand our role and our purpose and our motivation for going to war. And a lot of times I like reading a lot. And I've read a lot of different articles and a lot of different books on the War of 1812, as well as on the Anishinaabe, what I would say the Anishinaabe participation in the War of 1812. So the one that one title of an article, I forget who the author is now, but it was called "The Red Pawns Go to War." And so there's this idea that all of us Native people were just pawns in the war, that we had no motivation, and all we were waiting around for was the king to come and tell us, pick up the war hatchet and let's hear the war cry. And let's hear the war cry resound all throughout the woods. So this whole kind of romantic notion or even stereotypical notion of what we were about. But what they don't know is that we were allies for a long time, and that in 1760, after the British defeated the French on the Plains of Abraham, the British, particularly General Amherst, felt that they conquered the Anishinaabe as well. And when they felt they conquered the Anishinaabe as well, they came and they stopped giving presents. And what these Indian presents were, each year they used to come and they would have a gathering either at Kingston, and sometimes here it was York, but not in the early days, Niagara, as well as Amherstburg, which is Fort Malden, and Detroit, and then Michilimackinac. These were the main posts where they would affect this distribution of presents. And now what we would call, some call that back then, was tribute. You're on our land, so you're coming here and you're giving us something to keep staying on our land. Nowadays people would say rent. So all the time people would come to these different posts and they would get blankets, cloth for shirts, cloth for skirts. They would even get weapons. They would get guns, they would get ammunition, ball, shot, and powder. And then even when it's coming close to time to war, the actual presents increased. So sometimes they even were given sails for their canoes. So and other times they were given nets. And even here at York, Sir William Clowes at the time, just before the War of 1812, he actually had a blacksmith here. And what he had that blacksmith jig up, he designed this thing. But what we used to do, and we still do up where I'm from, is we fish by torchlight. We call it waswa. We end up fishing by torchlight, and we see the light reflect off the fish eyes, and then that's when we stab them. So back then, what we used to use was a pine knot and birch bark, and we'd hold that up, and then we'd be in the canoe, and we'd stab those fish. So part of these presents, what William Clowes did, he got his blacksmith. He designed this thing to a metal rod that would be affixed to the front of the canoe and hang out over, and then it actually was a carriage, and it kind of would swing so that it would stay stable instead of if it might tip over and the fire might go in. So he actually constructed a metal casing that would contain the pine knot, and it swung. So that's how elaborate they were outfitting us to live our lifestyle. But now later on, not even 50 years later, once they institute the Fish and Games Act, then they start throwing our fishermen in jail. They start confiscating our nets, confiscating our catch, and then they say you're in contravention of the Fish and Games Act. Whereas this treaty here that I'm talking about, that's an actual treaty enshrined in our minds and in our understanding that we had the right to do this all this time. So now sometimes you'll hear people talk about the 1763 Royal Proclamation, and they'll say it's the Magna Carta of Indian rights. But in our mind, it's actually this wampum belt. So this wampum belt is actually called the Silver Covenant Chain, and it has its antecedents with the Dutch and the Mohawks on the Lake Champlain. And the idea, the way it's told is that we said we first tie our hands together in friendship, and we used rope. They said rope isn't strong enough. So the following year we said our alliance is stronger, so we'll use iron. Said we made our alliance as strong as iron, and we tied our hands together in friendship with iron. Several years went by, and they said iron rusts, and it's not very expensive. He says, I value your friendship, so we're going to make this a silver covenant chain. It's just as strong as iron, but every year we know that silver will tarnish. And so every year we're going to get together and we're going to polish this chain so that the chain shines brightly. And of course it was a metaphor for relations between each other, that whenever we're getting together, they say we're going to polish the chain. And it really was to actually talk together to try and smooth any discrepancies they have or any disputes that they may have. So Amherst started not giving these presents. And then that's when Pontiac decided, well, these guys didn't conquer us. That's when he started making a confederacy. And then that's when he captured a number of forts, but he didn't capture a couple of critical forts. But the point was made, and then Sir William Johnson actually wrote to the Lords of Trade in Britain, stating that it would be cheaper to conquer their prejudices if we were to annually give them presents, and that's all what they really want. And that we acknowledge their ownership of the land, and we set aside rules of how to alienate that land. So what Sir William Johnson also recommended, he said, I recommend that we tie them down into peace in the forms that they would most readily recognize and acknowledge and abide by. And by this I mean that we would make a large wampum belt with intelligible figures thereon, and on that wampum belt we would actually bring out on every public occasion so that we would read it and they would read it. And now, of course, when we get up and we would read this belt, we would say, this is our understanding. And then what used to happen is Sir William Johnson and his successors would get up and then they would say, this is our understanding of this belt. Nowadays, when you have a board meeting, what you do is you say, well, let's read the minutes from the last meeting. And now we're all on the same page. That's how we used to do it, but with wampum. So the second belt in the middle there is called the 24 Nations belt. And these are the 24 nations that actually went to Niagara in 1764 because Pontiac actually forced the British back to the table and said, we own this land and you actually have to abide by our rules as well. And then that's what the British decided, that they're going to give this wampum belt. And they said at that time, we tie our hands together in friendship, and that as long as the British wore red, the sun traverses the sky, the grass grows and the waters flow, these promises will be adhered to. And that we will adopt you as our children if you will adopt us as your father. So that happened a year later when they actually adopted each other. But these 24 nations you see at the one end of the belt, of that middle belt, some say it's the rock at Quebec, others say it's all of North America, and then there's 24 men, they're all holding that wampum, what they would say the strong cord of friendship. And then that strong cord of friendship is actually tied to that ship at the other end. And the British officer at that time, Sir William Johnson, had said, that this boat would never be emptied. I'll never empty this boat. It'll always be full. And he also said at that time, we put in the middle of your island a tree. And then in the middle of that tree, all around that tree, we sweep around it. And after we've cleared it, we put down a mat. And we're going to sit down on that mat. And then actually after we'll put that mat there, we're also going to put a fire. And I say to you, this fire of yours will never go out. That's what they said at that time in 1764. And they also said, we pile here choice pieces of wood. And also in that tone, I put right beside that fire a poker. And if you ever think that that fire is burning low, stoke it and put more wood on, and then I'll know my children want something. So that's what these belts mean, and this is what the alliance between the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and this goes out to the Cree, as well as the Sioux on the plains, as well as what we call the what is called the Winnebago, or they call themselves the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sauk, the Fox, and then that's the 12 nations of the Western Confederacy. There's the Eastern Confederacy, which the 6 nations are a part of, and they also counted some of the Mi'kmaq and the Abenaki, as well as the Algonquin on that side, and the Nipissing. So this is an belt of alliance, and after Sir William Johnson died, he was succeeded by his son. And you see here it says SR, and it looks like IIBT, but that II is actually JJ, and that's Sir John Johnson, son and heir of Sir William Johnson. And he had to repledge this, because after the American War of Independence, where they ended up making the boundary, that they said they shook the belt, and the alliance was actually weakened at that point. And so Sir John Johnson said, well, we got to make this stronger. So that's why he made this Silver Covenant chain wampum belt, and he put the date 1786 on there, as well as his name. So the other thing is Sir William Clouse. This wampum belt at the top is actually was made by Sir William Clouse, and Clouse was often stationed here at York, and he also went to Amherstburg, and he worked a lot with the 6 Nations people, but also with what they call the Western Indians, which is the Western Confederacy. So you see here again that pipe of peace, and then you see 2 men at either end, and they're holding hands by either here is a string, and then you see the date 1807, and the initial is William Clouse. So here, this again is that idea of the covenant chain, that we are bound together by this wampum, and that we have mutual obligations. And to us, in our language, we call this Miigis in Ojibwe. Miigis is that wampum. And it actually has religious overtones, because in our Medewan Lodge, that's what they call the main shell that led us on our migration, that Miigis. So here, this is a belt that's at the Bacord Museum in Montreal. And the reason I show it is actually Tecumseh there's a speech recorded in November 1810. Tecumseh comes to Amherstburg, and he says that he has a belt that his kings had. But this isn't the belt, but this is the only wampum belt that I've seen in my travels that actually has 2 hands on it. So we were part of this alliance, and of course, I usually try to subtitle my presentation, The Anishinaabe War and the Role in the War of 1812, and the subtitle is More Than Tecumseh, because probably every one of you in here have heard of Tecumseh, and probably you all heard of the Shawnee, but probably, I don't know how many of you would have heard that the Sioux were part of this, the Winnebago, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Cree, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa, let alone any of those chiefs' names. Anyway, our chiefs actually went down to Prophetstown, and they were listening to the prophet, and this, of course, the prophet was Tecumseh's brother, and what we would now say, he trained some of his people to come up and spread the word. So there was actually a man, an Odawa named Nemegos, that means the trout, and he came up to L'Arbre-Croche, and he spread the word, the teachings of this prophet as well. And so we had intimate ties, although you have the idea that the northern Ojibwe and the northern Odawa are nomads. They have no fixed address. They're wandering around, scrounging for their next meal. They have no time for religious enlightenment, and they have no time to go meet with the governor, Lieutenant Governor Simcoe, let alone in the Department of Indian Affairs, Colonel Close. They're up in Michilimackinac, or they're up at what we now call Thunder Bay, but Ministigwaya, and they don't have time for that because they're living hand to mouth. They're scrounging for their next meal. These, of course, are the predominant stereotypes of what the Anishinaabe people were about. But here we were going down to Prophetstown. We were the ones looking for information, and we went down to see Governor Simcoe, and he gave us a wampum belt as well. But in November of 1810, Tecumseh delivered this speech at Amherstburg. He says, "Father, we have a belt to show you, which was given to our kings when he laid the French on their back. Here it is, Father. On one end is your hand, and on the other that of the red people. And in parentheses, both hands in black wampum, but the Indian end of the white belt darker than the other. End quote. Bracket. And in the middle, the hearts of both. This belt, Father, our great chiefs have been sitting upon ever since, keeping it concealed and ruling our country. Now the warriors have taken all the chiefs and turned their faces toward you. Never again look towards the Americans, and we the warriors now manage the affairs of our nation, and we sit at or near the borders where the contest will begin. Father, it is only 5 years ago that I discovered this belt and took it from under our king. You, Father, have nourished us and raised us up from childhood. Now we are men and think ourselves capable of defending our country, in which cause you have given us active assistance and always advice. We now are determined to defend it ourselves, and after raising you on your feet, leave you behind, but expecting you will push towards us what may be necessary to supply our wants. Tecumseh then ordered the belt be passed round and handled by everyone in attendance. So I haven't seen this belt. This is actually from the Klaus papers. This is a representation, and this is actually what William Klaus, I imagine that Klaus is the one who designed the wampum belt, and then he would commission one of the Haudenosaunee women to make this belt. So you see again, they follow a custom with the FG, meaning Francis Gore, and then they put on one side the Anishinaabe, and then on the other side who we call the Jaganash, the British. And then in the middle is that heart, and then here it says black, white, black, and then there's a white row, and that white row is always about peace and good relations. So here again, that white row is the white row of peace. And what the earlier documents say is that when the British actually gave a wampum belt like this to the Shawnee, they said that Sir William Johnson would get up and he would speak on this belt, and he would run his finger along that white road, and by the time he finished his discourse, he was at the heart. Then he would sit down, and then that Shawnee man would get up, representative, and he would talk, and then he likewise would run his finger along until he got to the heart, and he said, now we are of one heart with this belt. So that's how they used to talk about and use these wampum belts, and how they used to talk. But what Lieutenant Governor Gore said with his speech in 1808, "Children, it has been my wish and desire for a considerable time past to meet you in General Council of all the nations, that I might personally assure you of the King, your father's constant regard for his Indian children, and to tell you that the treaty made at Fort Stanwix in the year 1768 is still held sacred by your great father, as well as the treaty made by General Simcoe." So the point there is that the guys at Michilimackinac, they knew what this Fort Stanwix was. The idea when I was growing up, actually, when I thought we were so far away that we didn't know what was going on down here. But our chiefs actually were the ones that were entrusted with that main wampum belt, and it was held by the Odawa at Michilimackinac on behalf of those 12 nations. So they were the ones who were actually to sit there and to listen to these speeches, and then to convey the message to all the surrounding nations. They were the emissaries after when they came to this. Also, and this is Gore continuing, also to renew at this fireplace the ancient friendship which has subsisted for so long a space of time between your great father, your ancestors, and yourselves, and eventually and freely to communicate to each other in conformity to the engagements entered into by your forefathers and the English nation. With this belt, I therefore renew all our ancient friendship and those ancient customs which have been so wisely framed and agreed to by the general consent of all nations in the country. Children, I came not to invite you to take up the hatchet, but I wish to put you on your guard against any attempt that may be made by any enemy, whatever, to disturb the peace of your country. Children, make my words known, and send this belt of amity and friendship to all the Western nations or others who are confederates with you. So again, this is now we call it a magazine telegraph, but this is how they used to convey information to each other. And other non-native people used to comment on the minds of our ancestors, our native ancestors, how they were able to memorize these speeches with such accuracy after a period of time using these mnemonic devices, that they really marveled at our ability. So this is taken from the Shran papers, and this is actually an estimate that was done retroactively, maybe in 1814. It was also published in a book called His Majesty's Indian Allies by the late Robert Allen. But here he lists all the number of the population of people, of the warriors, what he called the Western Confederacy. So you see the Wendats or the Hurons at Sandusky, there's 450, in the Odawa and Chippewa around St. Clair, and this is supposed to be Saugeen. So the Bruce Peninsula, there's 350, and then the Odawas of Larbour Cross, Grand River and other rivers that fall into that lake, 550, and the Chippewas, which is Ojibwe, of Michilimackinac, St. Mary's on the north side of Lake Michigan, 400. And then the Shawnees, this is Tecumseh's tribe, there's 550. So you already see that numerically we already formed the majority. We have just got halfway through the actual table here. Mind you, these aren't 100% accurate, of course. These are educated guesses at that time of what people knew of the population. And like I like to say, we really practiced birth control and family planning because we're all even numbers here, 450. So you see the Potawatomi, there was 2,000 of them, and Ojibwe and Odawa at Saginaw Bay, there's 600, and Mississaugas of Grand River, Lake Erie, Bay of Quinte, this is the north shore of Lake Ontario, and there's 450 of them. And then the Ojibwe of Matchedash and Lake Simcoe, that's now where Casino Rama is. Of course, those numbers would jump up. Instead of being 70, there'd probably be triple that by now. So there's a total force of fighting men of 8,410, give or take 500, I would say. So this is augmenting the meager British force that is along the line. And I forget offhand how many British regularly trained soldiers there were, but there weren't a lot. They were significantly outnumbered by the American force, even though the American army was in disarray at that particular point in time. This is a painting of two Odawa chiefs, and it says that two Odawa chiefs lately come down to visit the president, who was Prevost at that time. So the idea is that this is actually an Odawa chief named Midas, and then this is another Odawa chief named Nawash. Now there's the other thing that when you're researching this, now that I know this, but I've noticed that not every Indian had only one name, and not that sometimes different names were used for a number of different people. So there was actually two chiefs named Nawash at that time, and later on I'll show you there were three chiefs named the Siganok, and they all fought during the War of 1812. So this kind of confuses matters sometimes when you're actually trying to come up with the numbers. But you see here he's wearing a garnished either elk robe and it'd be painted, and these are dyed red deer hair, and the actual tin cones line that, so you would be able to hear him when he'd approach. And these are all the silver gorgets that he's wearing, this chief here, and he's got a chief's hat that they used to give out. And they used to give out all kinds of ostrich feathers and stuff. So you'll see, like if you go to these exhibits and you see a picture of John Brandt, Joseph Brandt's son, and he's got this large feather. It's an ostrich feather, and that's what they used to give out as part of the presents, and the chiefs would wear them and stuff. So you see on July 17, 1812, Fort Michilimackinac was captured by Captain Roberts, 30 soldiers, 200 Canadian voyageurs, 113 Sioux, Menominee and Winnebago, and 280 Ojibwe and Odawa. But he doesn't actually say how many of the 280 were Ojibwe, nor does he say how many of the 280 were Odawa. Likewise, he doesn't say which chiefs they were or which bands they were from. So this is the perennial question, and whenever you see this and you read anything on the War of 1812, it'll say, and then Norton showed up with 300 Indians, or Norton showed up with 100 Indians, or Tecumseh showed up with his Indians, or General Brock brought in a force of 600 Indians. And it doesn't tell you much after, and you got to dig around and read and sift and sieve through all these archival documents as well as the oral tradition to come up with who was where and who fought. So the other thing that what's significant about this particular thing is Brock wrote to Captain Roberts and said, if you think you can take Fort Michilimackinac, do so. And then the next day, Roberts got a letter from Prevost, and he said, don't engage in any offensive measures at all. You are forbidden to engage the enemy. Brock wrote another letter and it arrived a couple of days later after that one. So this is the third letter that Roberts is getting. And he says, you've been told to have a adopt a defensive stance, but if you think the best defense is an offense and that you can take Fort Michilimackinac, do so. So he ended up saying, this fort, I have with me 30 men. They're old, and I would not be comfortable taking them into battle. We need the Indians. And if we were to go, and this whole Fort St. Joseph is in such a disarray that we would never be able to defend it. And he kind of hints to saying that it probably isn't even worth defending. So I feel compelled that I have to take Fort Michilimackinac with our Indian force. So that's what he did. He went and rallied up them, and then they went and they actually didn't have to kill too many people, and they took the first victory. The news of that traveled, and then all the native people that were hesitant to actually participate in the war decided, okay, we're going to side with the British. They were still wondering whether or not to side with the British or the Americans, and actually down here, the Haudenosaunee people, some of them sided with the Americans, some sided with the British. And up here as well, actually, I'll show you later that sometimes we had a few renegades who sided with the Americans. But on August 16, 1812, Fort Detroit was captured by General Brock with 330 regulars, 400 militiamen, and 600 warriors. Again, they're all unnamed. Nameless, faceless Indians show up and start screaming and yelling their head off, and then General Hull starts foaming at the mouth, and his tobacco starts running and dripping down his white cravat, and then he gives up. So that's where we are at. This is the kind of information that we get, and this is the information we get when maybe we get when we're in public school. Hopefully it's changing, that we get a bit more specific information.